Well, happy Wednesday, friends. Want to connect with you today, see how everyone is doing. And also, we're going to open up our Bibles and look at Psalm 13. So, when we look at Psalm 13, what we're going to see is it's a psalm of David, and it's a psalm of lament. And lament is an interesting idea, as I don't think it's something that we're all too familiar with as American Christians, and yet I bet the reality is for most of us, in the past few weeks, we have entered a season of lament, right? We mourn the loss of things which were once just taken for granted, right? We mourn the loss of our regular, everyday, common, expected lives. Maybe we even lament real things, right? We lament the loss of our income. We lament the loss of our jobs. We lament the loss of our children being educated in schools. And we simply lament the very real danger that is amongst us. Well, before we look at Psalm 13, I think it would be helpful for us to ask, well, what is lament? What does it mean to be in a season of lament? A quick Google search would tell you that to lament it's not really to complain or to just vent, but it's actually an expression of deep pain or deep sorrow. You are expressing, you aren't kind of caging your expressions. You aren't stuffing down your emotions, but you're opening up to them and you're admitting to them and you're expressing them to God. And so for the believer, for the Christian, lament is really actually an exercise of faith. It's encouraging vulnerability with God. Now, no one likes to be vulnerable. No one does. And yet here we're about to see, I should say, in Psalm 13, that David is extremely vulnerable. He's not hiding from God. He's not trying to look like he has it all figured out. He is simply baring himself to God. Well, to lament, it's really to cry out to God in our deepest doubts, in the midst of our troubles. But the key to the lament is that while we are free to do that, we still trust, we still hope, we still believe in God's provision and His ability to deliver us from that evil and from that despair. You see, to lament means that these prayers that we are offering to God, they are passionate, they are messy, but they always circle back to our faith in Him. Well, let's take a look at our psalm this morning. It's Psalm chapter 13, or Psalm 13, and this is a psalm of David. David wrote many of the psalms, and it's just clearly a prayer. And it's clearly a prayer of David being vulnerable and honest, and he's not sugarcoating how he's feeling. So let's read this together. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I will trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. And so we see even in Psalm 13 that David, while he is honest, while he shares true emotions in his prayer to God, he ends this prayer knowing and claiming and believing that God is still good and that God is in control and that God is the one who provides salvation. I think that's important as we enter into this time of unknown, as we've been living in this, right? We can be honest with him. We can share our frustrations with God. We can mourn the loss of our normal lives, and yet we stand firm knowing who God is, and we stand firm in the promises that he has made us. Well, why do we need to lament, right? I think a lot of us would rather not even consider lamenting, right? We've been taught since childhood that to express emotions can be really dangerous. To share how we really feel, it's not always the safest thing to do. And I wonder how many of us just feel, well, it's easier for me to kind of bury those thoughts and bury those emotions and just pick myself up by my bootstraps and just continue on working hard at life. And you know what? That's a good attitude to have as well. And yet we have to see in Scripture that it's okay to come to God frustrated. It's okay to approach him and not have all the answers and not know where he is leading us. And that is why we need to lament. And so for those of us, and this includes me, where lament feels new and possibly uncomfortable, I understand that. I get it. I feel the same way. I think it might be helpful. I want to share with you a couple quotes, a couple passages from a book called A Praying Life, and this is by Paul Miller. And what he addresses, I think it's very helpful for us, and he says this about lament. We think laments are disrespectful. God says the opposite. Lamenting shows that you are engaged with God in a vibrant, living faith. We live in a deeply broken world. If the pieces of our world aren't breaking our hearts, then we aren't in God's face about them. And we aren't in God's face about them, then we know that we've already thrown in the towel. In our attempts to meet the unspoken expectation of perfection within our Christian lives, we so often simply refuse to lament. We refuse to acknowledge the dark and difficult realities of our lives and our world in a way that honestly demonstrates our dependence on God. The reality, though, is that we have a deep need for this type of expression and a large catalog of examples throughout Scripture for how we can do it. I think he brings up a good point, right? We see lamenting throughout the Bible. There are many examples of lament throughout Scripture. The one place we could start is the book of Lamentations. Right? The book of Lamentations is actually, the entire book is one long prayer of lament, where the author, who was more than likely Jeremiah, he pleads with God over the evil and the suffering of the world. Or we could turn to Habakkuk, where the prophet, he cries out to God over the judgment that is to come for Israel. And God responds. We could read through so many of the Psalms, which are just filled with prayers of lament. I think some of us, as we consider this idea of lament, we are worried. Well, isn't it offensive to God if I pray this way, if I express myself to him? Doesn't it secretly mean that I'm not trusting in him? I think we need to be encouraged that we can look at Jesus and what he did. In Mark chapter 14, Jesus cries out to God at the garden right before the cross, and he says, Abba, Father, take this from me, right? Take this cup from me. So Jesus himself prays a similar prayer of lament. Now, this is new to me as well, and I'm going to be honest. I've never preached a sermon on lament, and I feel like because of what's going on in the world today, we're all kind of facing this new reality together. And so I don't have the perfect 5-step guide or 3-step sermon to how to lament. But I think if you're looking for somewhere to start, I'd encourage you just to follow Jesus' example, right? Cry out to God. Ask him for help, just like Jesus did. Tell him how you're scared. Tell him how you are frustrated. Tell him where you are doubting. Ask him the questions. Ask him the questions that you might be tempted to try to keep to yourself. Follow David's example in Psalm 13 and pray to God and say, How long? How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? But I think most importantly, we must conclude our prayers of lament with praise, right? We must finish our prayer just like we see in Psalm 13, where we submit ourselves to him and we are reminding ourselves what we know to be true and faithful about God in the midst of so much uncertainty. I want to share one more quote from Miller. This is this idea of what is breaking your heart? What is deeply concerning to you today? He says this: there is no such thing as a lament-free life. To love is to lament. So let your heart be broken by something. If you don't lament over the broken things in your world, then your heart shuts down. Your living, vital relationship with God dies a slow death because you open the door to unseen doubt and become quietly cynical. Cynicism moves you away from God, but lament pushes you into his presence. So oddly enough, not lamenting leads to unbelief. Reality wins and hope dies. To put it another way, the reality of a broken world triumphs over the new reality of a redeemed world. You miss resurrection and get stuck in death. Powerful words for sure, and hopefully they are helpful for each one of us today. Well, I think one thing I want to encourage you to do today is, as this video ends, if you have 5 or 10 minutes right after this video ends, go to God. Spend some time in prayer. If there's anything that we can do in the midst of all of this craziness, it's we can approach God and we can plead and beg and pray to him. We can be honest with him and we can lament with him. So let's do that. If you don't have time right now, make sure before you fall asleep tonight in your bed that you go to God in prayer. Maybe it's a prayer of lament. Maybe it's a prayer of praise. But approach your God. Pray for him. Pray to him, not for him. Pray to him. He listens to our prayers. It's the one thing I think that we need to be doing right now. And so consider your needs. Do you need to pray a prayer of lament? What's breaking your heart? What's the reality of your life or of this world that's just too much for you to bear on your own? What's causing you pain? What's causing you disappointment or fear? Go to God in prayer and rest in him, being reminded that God does, in fact, hear your prayers. He wants to hear from you. He wants to know how you are feeling. He wants you to be open. I hope this is helpful today. I know this looks a little bit differently, but I can't help but feel as we face this new reality, at least in the short term, Lord knows how long it'll be before we can meet together again. I know, even though I am new to our church community, I am lamenting this real sense of loss. And I think we each are feeling this same loss, whether it's the loss of our church community or the loss of so many other things. So let's go to God in prayer today. Have a great day, guys.